Hey guys, we're ready to begin a brand new study. We're going to be studying the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk. So we're going to be covering these 3 short chapters in Scripture in the Old Testament. We're going to go slow. All of the iWord Workshops studies are meant for you to be a better student of Scripture, that I'm just going to walk alongside you as a layperson. So we go really slow. We go verse by verse. And so this week, you're going to be in chapter 1 and you're going to cover verses 1 through 11. So that means you're going to wake up every day and you're going to pray and you're going to read those 11 verses. You're going to ask questions. If you have a study Bible, you're going to read the references. You're going to go back and read the historical context for it. You're going to read all the commentary at the bottom. I want you to really take the time to understand these first 11 verses, because the Old Testament Habakkuk is different than most of the prophets. You know, generally in the Old Testament, God would speak to the prophet and then the prophet would speak to the people. But Habakkuk is different in the sense that Habakkuk is going to speak to the Lord on behalf of the people, and God is going to answer him. And so we're really going to see this prayer that Habakkuk prays on behalf of the people. And so it's important to remember, and we want to keep this in historical context. So this was written, most scholars believe, around 604 BC. It was written during the time period right at the end of the Assyrian Empire, but just prior to the Babylonian Empire. So that's what we're going to see here. We're going to see God's people. You know, Habakkuk is lamenting, is complaining to the Lord because he's burdened for God's people. You see, when we read this section of Scripture, we need to understand that God's people are in sin, and that the entire nation is ignoring the law, is twisting the law, is in outright rebellion to God in their sinfulness. And so this makes Habakkuk sad. And so Habakkuk is going to pray to the Lord for him to intervene, because he really wants revival. He wants to see them be anew, revived, after this deep sin in which God's people have fallen into. So that's what we're really going to see in our study of Habakkuk. So let's jump in to chapter 1. Today's video is only going to cover the first 4 verses, which is Habakkuk's prayer to God, Habakkuk's complaint to God, and then on Friday we'll cover verses 5 through 11. So open up your copy of Scripture to Habakkuk chapter 1, and this is what it says. It says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. And generally, when you do a little bit of study about oracles, it's not a word we use very often today, but it really means this burden. And generally, oracles were written about the pagans, about the Gentiles. But this oracle, or this burden that Habakkuk had, was for God's people. And so he's going to tell God what he sees, and he's going to ask God why he hasn't intervened and how long before God will intervene. And so when we study this Old Testament prophet, we want to learn about who God is and what he's done and what he will do. We want to learn about the character of God, the sovereignty of God. That's what we're really going to see in this Old Testament prophet. So after he said the oracle that Habakkuk saw, look at Habakkuk's complaint in verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? And so when you see that, you know, there'll be some people that are confused about the audience, but the audience is Judah, is the Jewish people, is God's covenant people. And you see that in how Habakkuk addresses the Lord. He uses that covenant name of God. Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and will you not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save. And so Habakkuk says, I've been crying out to you. You know, it's gone from a really low cry to a high pitch. You know, I'm actually screaming out in some commentaries that say, you know, that he uses 2 different words there. I think in the New American Standard, he uses the word, how long will I call for help? And do you not hear? I cry out to you, violence. And so you see that exclamation point after violence, you know, that it goes from a call to a cry. And so we see that. And you see how really Habakkuk has this relationship with God where he can complain, where he can cry out. And, you know, so often our prayers are so weak and we don't even understand it. And our prayers sound more like Santa's wish list than anything else. That you see that our prayer lives are a reflection of our relationship to God. And so you can see that Habakkuk has a deep, faithful relationship with God. That's why he can complain. That's why he can cry out. That's why he asks God, how long? And so we see who Habakkuk is in this prayer and this pleading. And then he says, why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. And so you see this picture of this society where iniquity, he sees it everywhere. Habakkuk is looking at his people, God's people, in deep, dark sin. You see, they know what sin is. They have the Mosaic law. They know what is right and what is wrong, and they're living openly in sin. And this is all Habakkuk sees. And then he says, destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. Do you see this deep dive into depravity because of the openness of the sins of God's covenant people? And so this is a burden to Habakkuk. So he cries out. Then he says, so the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. So justice goes forth perverted. And he says, the people in power, the people who are supposed to be enforcing the laws, who are supposed to be judging wrong and sin and punishing it, are not. The law is paralyzed. You see, they're neutralizing the truth. And, we know that this is always the downfall of a society, when there's no right and wrong, when truth is perverted and the law is paralyzed. Once again, we're seeing Habakkuk is painting this picture of this time period in Judah, but we see this in our world today. We know that we see some similarities to this. And so I want us to ask ourselves, how are we responding? Are we calling out like Habakkuk did? And are we being honest before the Lord? Do we want God to step in and stop the sin? And once again, these sins are of the people of God. This is not the pagans. He's not speaking to how bad the world is. He's talking to those who are God's covenant people here. And so he says, justice never goes forth. It's for the wicked surround the righteous. The one thing, the bright spot we see in this is that there are some righteous. There is a small remnant of the righteous in this day that are being faithful. And that's what really Habakkuk's pleading for those people. Because here they are, they're trying to live by faith. They are being obedient. They're trying to stay out of sin. They are listening to God's laws. But see, they're surrounded by all these other people and their leaders who are perverse, who are corrupt, who are sinful, who don't want real justice. And so he says, so justice is actually being perverted. They're spinning the laws. They're spinning the truth. And so it's a deep, dark time in the nation of Israel in this time period. And Habakkuk goes straight to God and complains and says, how long? Do you see this? And, we know that when we get to verse 5, God is going to answer. So I wrote down, when you see this section of scripture and you're kind of wondering how to process it, the prophet Habakkuk wanted cleansing. He wanted purging. He wanted chastening. And ultimately, he wanted revival among the people so they would return to righteousness. And so we see that Habakkuk pleads before the Lord with his complaints about this so that the Lord would intervene. And so we want to learn about how to pray like this. We want to pray like Habakkuk.